So welcome to Pacifica Online. I'm Laura Lee Scott, Director of Pacifica Online, and I'm thrilled to be talking today with Samuel Kimbles. Sam is a psychologist, a Jungian analyst, a member and former president of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, and a clinical professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of California, in addition to maintaining a very busy private practice of his own. He's also the author of the book Intergenerational Complexes in Analytical Psychology, and he's going to be offering a 4-week online series with Pacifica Online in March, The Suffering of Ghosts, working with traumatic cultural histories that continue to haunt us. Sam, thank you so much for taking some time with me today, and welcome.
Thank you, Laura Lee. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you here. And again, I am really excited about your material. Sam and I were talking before I hit the record button, and I told him every time I go back to his book and open it up, I find more pieces of it that I underline. It's quickly becoming one of the most underlined resources in my library. So Sam, let's start with kind of an obvious question, but an interesting one, which is what led you to write this book? The Suffering of Ghosts, Intergenerational Complexes in Analytical Psychology. What motivated you?
Well, for quite a number of years before writing at all, anything to do with cultural complexes, I had tried to squeeze my understanding of what was happening analytically and clinically into a model which focused on the individual internalized aspect of being a human being. And because of the Jungian idea with that is that you work toward developing a sense of self through connection to that inner world. Unfortunately, for me at the time, I had had other kinds of experiences with group processes, especially racialized group processes. And so I didn't find that as I went through my training program and started working more deliberately in the Jungian model, that there was a real shortcoming, limitation for not just the Jungian model, but the analytic approach altogether, which focused so much on internal life of persons, and that's a very important focus. Unfortunately, for the analytic world, the larger cultural context was missing from that model. And so I know that for my own development, I really did need to link up what I was learning about how to think analytically, how to think about internal processes and archetypal symbol process. I needed to link all that up to a cultural setting that made some sense to me. And in the process of doing that, that was the initial kind of work that I did, was to introduce the concept of cultural complexes. And that came from a paper that was a couple of years before that, maybe 2 or 3 years before that, about the myth of invisibility, in which I didn't know this is what I was thinking about, but it was about the invisibility of the cultural dimension as it operated within the context of an individual psyche.
So you write this statement, this really provocative statement, because I'm constantly sitting with the recognition of the kind of the time that we live in, and the irony that we exist in a period where I think psychological modalities, material, even the vernacular is more accessible today than it has ever been before. And yet we're living in the midst of a mental health crisis. And I think we have to ask ourselves why. And I think your work speaks to, this is a much bigger and much more nuanced conversation, but I think your work speaks to that, because we're working with models that treated the psyche as if it was this sanitized, completely independent entity that was not influenced. And we know even in neuroscience, culture impacts the architecture of the brain, literally. So you write this statement in your book when you write, the line between what is clinical and what is not needs to be crossed. And then you go on. Can you explain what you mean by that? The line between what is clinical and what is not needs to be crossed.
Yeah, well, the clinical boundary has, again, always been some sort of focus on an internalization of a world of family development in which traumas may have occurred or early childhood kinds of experiences, and then the process of becoming, let's say, an adolescent and then a young adult and so forth. All the model about how you focus on that in an internal sort of way. But as I mentioned earlier, that the world has not only changed, but it's gotten more translucent. The boundaries between inner and outer are really very loose today. And for instance, just to associate to what you just asked about, there's so many, I said the last 2 or 3 years with the pandemic and so forth, almost every person that I see doing a week's work, at some point or other, make a commentary, a comment about what's going on in their cultural, social context. And essentially they're saying to me 2 things. One is that I'm aware that there's a lot going on, and this work that we're doing together is more about me internally. At the same time, I can't exactly get rid of that sort of thing. And when I think about all those things that are going on in the world, I begin to feel overwhelmed. But I know we can't talk about that. So the patient brings in his or her ambivalence about talking about the other kinds of influences that they are experiencing that affects their sense of themselves and their subjectivity. So that's an example of the boundary has been smudged away in some particular way, and our models have focused as if the boundary is still there. It's just not there at the moment in the same way that we had 50, 100 years or so ago. I just
And
want
do you think that's a necessary, I mean, do you think that this is this word is so overused, but kind of a paradigmatic reshaping of our understanding of psyche and the way that psychoanalytic work is practiced?
Well, that could be, one way that I think about it is, the practice, the model itself needs to be looked at, and but the understanding of the psyche, as you mentioned earlier, has been sanitized, and it has become a kind of persona-oriented psychology in which you just need to work on this and work on that problem, get focus on this, and get a medication for that, and so forth. And so the psyche has been sort of collapsed into a bunch of achievements that people need to do in order to feel better about so forth and so on. But and what we know from deep work with folks over time is that the psyche is much more complicated than that. So even though television, phones, social media, and so forth have revealed an enormous amount about cultural psychology, still the understanding of what constitutes a psyche, or what constitutes a psychological orientation toward these large problems, are really not developed at all. If you look at the news, even as blatant as Maurice Nichols' recent shooting, the extent of the psychology for many people came in to see me and said, these was 5 Black officers shooting a Black man. I don't understand that. How the hell that happened? That kind of thing. So they're asking a question that requires a psychological response and a psychological answer. They're trying to understand it psychically. They're telling us that their psyche is reacting to something that doesn't make sense to them. And so to take that up and open that up is to get into what their psyche is doing with how they're trying to process it, how they're making sense of it, and so forth and so on. And in that way, we begin to see what the psyche is doing with that experience.
Yeah. So you're really, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, you have to get into working with what is happening in the unconscious, which is what your work has been. You write in your preface of your book that, this book is, in your words, my way of calling attention to the unacknowledged, unprocessed consequences of group traumas that I have personally seen appear and reappear over and over again. And in part of doing that, and again, I know we're trying to condense an incredibly deep and nuanced topic into a short conversation here, but you coin or introduce a term in this work that is, I think, brilliant and intriguing, with the term phantom narratives. Can you go into a little bit about what that term means in your work?
phantom narrative. So in a lot of ways, cultural complexes was the concept that I introduced first to talk about how the psyche functions in large group processing and become part of the internal relationship of the individual to the group as a whole. So you're about family groups or small groups or being part of an institute, whatever. The psyche, our psyche is geared to locate us within the context of group experiences. That's what we know. There's no world in which individuals are freed up from being influenced by groups, family groups, school groups, and so forth and so on. So when you begin to look at that, you realize that the psyche has its own unconscious process of processing our relationship to these kinds of group experiences. And so what was lacking for me, and I think it's lacking in a lot of psychology, is can we look at what the psyche is doing with the reality of the individual's experience in relationship to these large group processes? And can we begin to look and follow the psyche's response as a way to work with them both internally, but also in our relationship to the group? And can we provide a way to offer that framework, that attitude to others who may be in a very similar way trying to understand this large change in our cultural process? And so, excuse me, over the time, those kinds of questions allowed me to recognize that, oh, the psyche has a kind of a narrative. And once we get involved with it, let's say the Nichols situation, you say, why hasn't this black man are killing another black man in a way that I've seen so many times as white folks doing to people of color? Well, that's a psychological question. It's also a political question. The psychological part of it is, well, we get to see what the impact of a system has on thinking and one's identification with a group. The system that these officers were involved in expressing had to do with their being socialized to think about others, whether they're black, pink, white, or yellow, as someone who is dehumanized and needs to be dominated. Also, there's the internalization of racism by these officers that's built into that response. And so that would be a way, again, of asking a psychological question of how is it that a system of thinking about how we relate to criminals or people who are breaking the law becomes bigger than the racialized identifications that you would think would be there as a kind of a check. Mm-hmm. But obviously, groupthink is bigger than that particular check as seen in this particular situation.
Yeah. And so you're talking about a form of internalized oppression. I mean, women understand this. Anyone who's been forced to exist in the margins understands how that works. But I think, so let me ask you one last question as we bring this to a close for now. And then for those of you who are listening and watching, I really encourage you to get on board with this series. It's going to be an incredible 4 weeks with Sam. But let me ask you this. How do you recognize the presence of a phantom narrative? Because I love the name, because I think it so captures the fact that these phantom narratives kind of exist out of sight. Like you have to learn to see what's not making itself clearly visible, right? So what would you say to someone asking you, Sam, how do I recognize or hear a phantom narrative?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that's would be easier to give by way of an example. For instance, the situation that happened with George Floyd was a condensation of enormous amount of historical violence, oppression, and blindness on the part of the American culture. It reveals something. So one thing that we begin to see is that once we recognize we're responding to something that's bigger than the personal, then we can ask ourselves, what am I responding? How am I making sense of what I'm seeing and how I'm experiencing things, and so forth. And that brings us into contact, in this case, with the large group, the group of racialized subjectivities that we have internalized in the context of being an American, for instance. And so, when you begin to look at it from that particular point of view, that leads us to an unacknowledged, unassimilated, unprocessed relationship to racialized presences that are existent in our daily life. And that began to let us know that there's a link to something bigger that has a meaning and a presence that I have not allowed myself to acknowledge, recognize, and now how do I process it?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's recognizing that there are group phenomena that affect us on a subconscious or unconscious level, and they affect us because there are stories and attitudes and feelings and beliefs that are connected to what they mean to the larger group of which we are a part, or what they mean to the group that's being on the side of, on the dehumanized side. That comes with a story or a narrative. And those narratives and those stories tend to represent as figures in some particular way. And relating to those images and those figures is one way to open us up to what the unconscious is doing at the level of the group. And then that allows us to get to these unassimilated, unacknowledged, unprocessed sort of histories that are alive in us every day.
This incredible material, Sam. And so let me ask you one, I think I already said one final, but let me ask you one more final question. This is the final one. Do you see hope for us? Do you see hope for us in terms of hope for us as humanity and with regards to all of this?
Well, I think a psychological attitude would be a hope for next step for our humanity. In other words, things are more complicated than we think, and if we think about them, they are even more complicated. And yes, I think what we're missing, in addition to all the other things we do in economic, politically, and so forth, we have the term systemic racism, structural racism, and those kinds of things. Young people are on top of that. They understand what that means and what that looks like. Those are hopeful signs that we're now beginning to see the system in which we live that are affecting us. And the thing I'm adding is that, yes, those systems have been there all along. What's been missing is a psychological attitude that allows us to see not only how they're affecting us, but how they affect how we feel, how we see others, how we process ourselves, and more importantly, the history that gave rise to them to begin with. And in that particular time, we are able to sort of lift up the conversation from more than rational to the aspect of being that the early analytic folks from the Freud to the Jungians to the Klein were in touch with. It look, there's more going on than what meets the eye. And how to conceptualize that became looking at the individualized, internalized side of that. And I'm saying yes, and we need to see that as part of a larger context of cultural context. And in addition, that culture comes with an enormous amount of historical things that we have not did much work with, and that needs to be taken up. If we look at the suppressions of critical race theory and so forth, and books that can be read and coming from the government, so it's as if law is being used to forbid the psyche from being engaged, even in an educational setting, where thinking could be the way that it's taken in. That's being cut off. So we have to see that there's on a representational way, a threat that being psychological tends to arouse in people, because then you have to deal with your own feelings and your own reactions, your own thoughts, other people's feelings and other people's suffering. So the hope is that we can make that shift, and that could be a game changer.
Well, Sam, you say this in your acknowledgments that I think summarizes there's hope, but you write this. You write, to mix a metaphor, living with cultural complexes is not like a soft sleeping pillow. There are edges, bumps on the journey. Stony is the road. So, and I think, you know, I want to say thank you, because yes, stony is the road. Is there hope? Yes, but we have, as we all are aware, and some more keenly and tragically aware than others, there are a lot of bumps on the road and a lot of, I think, challenges still in front of us. So thank you for, I think, this incredible piece of work that paves the way for many of us. So thank you, Sam, for your work. Thank you for this conversation. I look forward to being a part of this series.
Well, thank you, Laura Lee. Great having a chance to chat with you about all of this. And I'm excited about participating in this particular series. I think it should be interesting and fun, and hopefully deeply meaningful for folks.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you, Sam.